I want to first thank the organizer for having our paper in the program. And also, it's my great pleasure to be here to share my research with you. So let me get started. In this paper, we estimate a dynamic model of health, education, and wealth. So part of this model is motivated by the large disparity in health, education, and wealth, which we observe in the data. So we're trying to understand, using this model, what are the socio-economic determinants and their quantitative importance for such disparity. And also, we are very much interested in the pathways, specific mechanisms through which the health, education, and wealth are determined over a life cycle model. Let me start with a motivation. So this is from our sample, which is NSLY 97 white males. I will describe in our sample in much detail in the data description. But for now, just to give us a little bit motivation in terms of what are the relationships between the early endowments, family backgrounds, as well as the college graduation. So here is on different 4 beams are the ASVAB scores. So, and at the y-axis is the rate of 4-year college graduation at age 25. So the first thing we observe is that very naturally we see that as individuals' cognitive ability measured by ASVAB score increase, we see a much larger increase in the probability of graduation from the college, 4-year college. And more importantly, I want to draw your attention to the small beams inside of each of the ASVAB score quantiles. What we see here is, for example, the blue bar is for parents that have less than high school education. And also we have, if you see what the first thing we see is that individuals' 4-year college graduation rates increase with your parents' education. And more importantly, if you look at those are the smartest kids measured by ASVAB scores. And but if we condition on their ASVAB score and we compare what are the probability of graduating from 4-year college if your parents are high school dropouts is only 30%. And however, if you look at another spectrum, which is the kids who are very smart and also have very educated parents, their 4-year college graduation is much higher, actually 80%. So this motivates us to think about what are the socio-economic determinants of the education choices. And first of all, we would think about ability are very important. And the second, that is we want to think about is borrowing constraint also very important, because we know actually from the data that parents with higher education, they tend to also give a little bit more financial support to their children. And that could be one of the reason why we see such pattern in the data. And another possibility could be just there are difference in preference heterogeneity that is influenced by their parents. So we want to take that into account. So this is one of our first motivation slides. Now the second, what I want to point out is that there are also interactions between health by education. In particular, in here is again, it's from our sample. What we see here is that in this first subgraph, we see that we graph individual by their college, by their education categories. We have 4 education categories: high school dropout, high school graduates, some college, and 4-year college. And on the y-axis, what I have is the fraction of individual between age 25 and age 30 who report that they have poor or fair health status, which is considered to be a very bad thing. What we see here very immediately is that individuals who have higher education also tend to have good health. So actually, this is one of the motivation evidence for many of the health economists to think about health. To think about education actually is an input to your health production. Now, another graph is that if we look at one of the healthy behavior, one of it, that is regular smoking, we see a similar pattern. That is, individuals who have better education, they also are the ones who have less likely to smoke. And similarly, as labor economists, we also know that there is large disparity in wages and wealth by education. I'm not going to look into detail about it. And lastly, I want to motivate, that is, not only there is an impact coming from education to health, but also it looks like from the data that individuals who have initial good health are also the ones who in their later lives tend to have better education and a better wealth. So here is what it looked like in the data. In the data, we measure individuals' health in one of the measures, that is at age 17, what is your self-reported health status? And on the y-axis, we plot out the years of education at later life, age 25 to age 30. You see that individuals who report that they have excellent health in the very young age, age 17, at their adult life, they also tend to have high education. And similarly, we see this kind of a grid respect to net worth. So this is like those three graphs are the motivation evidence that motivate us partially to think about health, education, and wealth together jointly in a life cycle framework. So what do we do in this paper? We develop a framework to analyze the dynamic relationship between health, education, and wealth. And we have three features in this model. So the first feature is that we're going to have a human capital production function as everyone else presented in this conference. And also we're going to introduce a health production function. And health will be treated as a form of productive input to your human capital. And also we're going to introduce addictive preference in unhealthy behavior. Because if you think about in many of the developing countries, we find out much of the health difference is determined by your behavior, such as bad behavior like smoking, heavy drinking, and such behavior in many of the literature are found to be very addictive. So we want to really have a good model for such unhealthy behavior. And lastly, we're going to consider endogenous boring constraint, which is linked with our first motivation graph. And we want to quantify the importance of the socioeconomic determinants of human capital inequality as well as health inequality. And in particular, because we have such a complicated structure model, we are able to estimate causal relationships between different factors. And more importantly, with this model, we will be able to really tackle down the importance of every economic mechanisms which we have already built into this model. So in terms of related literatures, we are also standing in the shoulder of giants. As you can see, this paper is linked with three different strands of the literature. And the first one is human capital, education, and credit strengths. And the second is a literature on education and health, and how does education impact health. And last one, our paper is related to the rational addiction literature. And also on the unhealthy behavior. In the interest of time, I won't go into details of each of those papers. But I still want to I think it's useful to have a relative comparison to say what are the relative contributions of our paper compared to the previous literature. So essentially, our paper have a unified framework, and we will show in our simulation that it is useful to have such unified framework because all those factors, they are endogenously involved over time and they interact with each other. And in pros of a structure model, very typical, we will be able to capture life cycle dynamics. We will have different mechanisms because this model is pretty much involved in a kind of Markov process along the life cycle. We will be able to control for reverse causality, and we will also have introduced parental factors, unobserved cognitive and non-cognitive abilities. But the bad thing is that, of course, we will have to make assumptions on functional form, on distribution. I want to be upfront about that. Now let me directly go to the model. So an agent in our model makes the following decisions. First, the agent decides his consumption and savings level, which is continuous variable. And also the agent can make a decision, a discrete decision about whether to conduct unhealthy behavior or not, and such things like smoking. And the agent can also make the education decisions, basically is enroll in school or not. And last decision is working decision. 0 determines not working, dk equals to 0.5 means part-time working, and 1 means full-time working. Also, we impose a time constraint which says that an individual cannot be full-time working and full-time in school in the same time. just as a notation, all those little d's will be our discrete decision variables. And now let me introduce our state space. So because we are very ambitious in capture many of the economic mechanisms as well as the socio-economic determinants, and our model have a very large state space that we need to condition on for individuals to make their decisions. The first is that those little thetas, these are the individual's cognitive ability and non-cognitive ability. Cognitive ability, we know about it loosely. We can think about it as IQ, how smart you are. Non-cognitive ability are the ones, essentially, what is your attitude? Your attitude towards risky behavior, we will have measures for these two latent abilities. And also we have health, those are H, which will be endogenous determined over time. Years of schooling, this will be accumulated this will be what I refer to as education. And we have net worth. And also this is QT, little QT is our addiction stock. That is the habit, basically trace out how long you have been smoking with a depreciation rate, this delta Q. And also we trace individuals' work experience. Your work experience will accumulate over time, but if you do not work in the previous period, it will have some depreciation associated with that. We also would condition on individuals' the previous schooling decision because there will be return to school cost of returning to school. And also we will control for the state space would have parental education and net worth. This will be our parental factors inside of the model.
Is there heterogeneity obviously the thetas, I guess there are. Where is heterogeneity here? You have heterogeneity, say, in addictive, the delta Q, addictiveness?
Delta Q is a parameter. Basically, that will be the same for everyone. That will be the same for everyone. So, yeah.
Is all the heterogeneity in the thetas, or?
So initial heterogeneity would be mostly coming from thetas and H. So we also allow for initial difference in health to be different, and also the parental background factor would be different. The rest would just accumulate over time. Well, over time will be different. Yeah, thank you. So in terms of preference and technology, so the preference is given as, we can separate the preference into three parts. The first part is the preference on consumption. So when we parameterize it, we will assume a CRA utility function. The second term of the preference is the preference on unhealthy behavior. You see that this little q is your decision, and this UQ is your preference received if you smoke. And the last part is your preference or utility cost / utility flows coming from schooling and working decision. And in particular, you see that if your utility is higher, if your utility is increasing with the stock of your unhealthy behavior, and then our model would be able to exhibit this addiction in the model. And also in terms of health, so this is how health involves. You can see that tomorrow's health is a function of current health. So current health enters tomorrow's health determination would make this whole process very persistent. And also your future health would be affected by your unhealthy behavior. And as well as we allow for your future health to be affected by your schooling and working decision, in the sense that those could potentially affect your time availability, which we do not directly, this would be our way of including that part. And also your consumption would also affect your future health. And the education level, this is what we have been talking about, the direct impact, the direct causal impact of education on health, that is improving the allocation efficiency as being proposed in the Grossman 1972. And also, lastly, we have this little two thetas. It's to allow your cognitive ability and non-cognitive ability to affect your future accumulation process of health as well. Because of the persistence in self-productivity of health itself, and this would make sure that once we have a temporary shock, this would be very persistent. And the labor market skills are the ones that is human capital in our model. And the human capital depends on your health level. This is saying that health is productive, and your education level, your work experience, as well as your two unobserved abilities, cognitive and non-cognitive. And your wages is determined by your human capital level plus this term. Think about this term as a rental price, and we allow this term to be differ by whether you are part-time working or full-time working, as well as if you are part-time working, whether you are in school or not. So subjective discount rate here is what we have. We allow the subjective discount rate to depend on cognitive and non-cognitive ability, because people do find that the individual with higher cognitive and non-cognitive ability tend to be the ones who are more patient. And the health also affects your subjective utility function, because effectively, if I am a very healthy individual and if I can live longer, that effectively is that I'm more patient. That would affect my decision horizon. That's our way of introducing health to affect your subjective discount rate here, because we do not directly model mortality in our model. Okay.
So the utility for smoking depends directly on education?
Yes.
So how should we think about that?
That's a very good question. Thank you for asking. So the reason, this is what I've been thinking about this, that is there's a possibility that as I become more educated and I understand the harm, I think I just dislike smoking more, either because I have better health knowledge or because I am associated with my peers who they don't have a higher probability of smoking. And in here, it is true that we don't actually try to disentangle which channel it is for the education to affect your smoking. We just loop it together into this preference parameter.
Yeah, just make the mortality rate depend on it. Why not just make the mortality rate depend on its effective discount factor? So if you have more education, you got more to lose. So.
Yeah, actually, that is one of the way we were thinking that we could allow the discount rate also directly depends on the education, years of education.
You might just call it mortality instead, or it's effectively the same thing.
Yes, effectively the same thing. If we directly match up our model with mortality data, we would be able to separate the discount rate from the mortality rate. For now, in later when I describe identification, this is essentially how patient you are. That's what we are capturing here. But I agree with you. If we have mortality data, we will be able to do that. The thing is, those individuals are pretty young in our sample. So we have not done that. Thank you. Yeah.
Is it straightforward that does not create dynamic inconsistencies?
In what sense, inconsistency?
So it's like, I wake up tomorrow, now I have more knowledge of my new theta C that I didn't have yesterday, so my time preferences are changing. I might want to revise the plan that I had made in the past.
So
Thetas don't change.
your status does not change.
H does. Well, your point is HT.
Yeah.
Affects it well.
Let me think about that. We have not really. You remind me of this. How does this model relate to the hyperbolic discounting model? No, not that way. Yes, we will take expectation of this one.
So you're accounting.
Let's see.
But if the education and the utility is knowledge, then you're forward-looking. So it's I don't know that.
Yes.
So you're going to be assuming I don't know that smoking is bad, but if I do get educated, I'll learn it.
Yes, in that sense that this model is fully rational. So you would have your expectation about the future, and in the next period you would update again, according to your new education status, your health as well as your wealth.
You can argue that more educated people know more about it and that it's rational without modeling the learning process.
This is not learning, it's full information. So you know everything, yeah.
You just said,
I should be more very careful with my wording. I should have said that as individual states revolve, as your states evolve over time, you make decisions on each of your state at that time. yeah, I should be more careful with my words. Thank you. Yeah.
I think the
Yes.
force of this question is, if somebody asks you down the tree, do you wish you had a different H than you have now?
I wish I have a different age than I have now.
That's the source of what you call time inconsistency.
But you might because of the updating. You have these
Yeah,
shocks that go on.
Yeah,
But that's true in full information, not.
absolutely.
Okay.
So it's still,
So the preferences are
Regret. I would say that's a
You
regret.
shouldn't beat that up. You're not gonna be able to
Inconsistency.
recursively. So that's basically that's I think if you have beta delta or hyperbolic discounting, you're not gonna be able to write recursively the problem. You're gonna have to solve, right? And I thought that was sort of the question, not about the fact that I don't know if we're saying the same thing.
Okay, let me think more about that. But for now, so when individuals make decisions, they would have they would be forward-looking according to the true process of the technology accumulation process and make their decisions optimally. And so this is the budget constraint. What does it look like? So individuals, you have your consumption, and if you choose to go to school, you would pay your tuition cost. And also, if you choose to conduct unhealthy behavior, you would have a cost associated with that as well. And this is your next period. Wealth, and this is equals to your gross savings plus your wages. That would of course depend on your human capital level and also your work decisions. And here is the fraction which we allow for parental transfer. So in this parental transfer, this is a function that your parents would make a decision based on their own education level as well as their wealth level to transfer certain amount of money to individual based on individual's own decision about schooling and working. And also we would have a government transfers. So here is the crediting strand part. So crediting strand is modeled as a lowest bound of possible, the lowest bound of the next period savings that has to be bigger than, you have a particular amount of student loan you can borrow. That is, the student loan limit is modeled by a flow limit as well as a total limit. And also individuals are allowed to borrow up to a private debt limit. And this debt limit is modeled as a function that is a function of your age as well as your human capital level. This is pretty standard as King and Whoop in 2001 paper. We follow their functional form. And this is a model solution. Basically, I'm going to skip this because this is pretty standard. In terms of to close the model, we need to specify what are the initial conditions.
Did you say something about health shocks? I mean, I didn't. Are there?
So this would be the health shocks here.
Absolutely.
So I kind of thought that there might be, like in bankruptcy literature and stuff like in the PSID, they say that the second biggest reason for bankruptcy is medical shocks. So I was kind of envisioning there would be some kind of a expenditure that you couldn't pay for in your budget constraint, and then how that would interact with the borrowing constraint potentially.
So a simple answer to your question would be we do not consider the medical cost here. But to put it longer is that those individuals they are relatively young, so the medical expenditure to them is not that a big concern. But Donati have very nice paper about the medical expenditure and the savings for the old individuals, and also another reason we don't do that is we don't observe medical data in our sample.
Sorry, another thing that's, I guess it's the same, there's no health insurance information either.
We don't have health insurance information, but however, we do think that if health education level actually is a very good predictor for your health insurance. If you look at individuals who have 4-year college degree, they are with 90% of the individual would have health insurance if they associated with their employer. And also another reason we don't think that's a big concern is because studies, for example, like Oregon Medicaid experiment find out health insurance effect on your health per se is pretty low. So let me continue. Okay, let me continue from here. So in the initial distribution, we assume that the cognitive ability, non-cognitive ability, and health are measured with error. And in particular, for each unobserved factors, we will introduce a measurement to, in terms of this measurements equations. And this observed measurements would provide us, will enable us to estimate an initial distribution of these three factors conditional on observed variables. And the data description. So we are using the NSOY 97. So over the time 1997 to 2011, we focus on white males, so that would free us from discrimination and gender difference. In total, we have about 2,100 individuals and with 27,000 observations. So in terms of measures of health, we utilize health status, BMI, and whether you have a health condition. And we use the full set of ASVAB scores as a measurement for cognitibility. With respect to non-cognitibility, we have 3 sets of adverse behaviors, which has been used in the previous studies as good predictor for your basically risk, attitudes towards risk. Mental health will be here. Will be in the health conditions. That will be. This is part of the health condition measure. Are you have a mental health problem or not? Yeah. Thank you. So and we observe many key choice variables over time, such as unhealthy behavior. In our model, in the data would be regular smoking, schooling, working part-time, full-time, and the wages, net worth. So we calibrate some of our parameters which can be estimated without using our model outside. So in particular, we fixed the risk aversion parameter to be 1.5. The borrowing interest is 4%, and the lending interest rate is 1%. And we also used the finance. We also calibrate the student loan. The flow limit to be $11,000, and total limit to be $35,000. And you see that we also utilize different data sources to get to the basically the cost parameters. Yes.
What do you mean by can be clearly identified without using our model?
Oh, it basically means that we don't. For example, our model is a partial equilibrium model. We do not need to pin down the interest rate with using our model. Maybe my wording is not very good, but basically those are the parameters. We either estimate outside the model or we calibrate. Yeah, this is a choice we made, and let me talk about why we make that choice. So before that, so in terms of estimation for the initial distribution of factors, the sufficient condition we rely on is that at least there will be 3 measurements for each observed factors. Now, one of the key parameter of interest is the discount rate here. So if you write down the Euler equation, this is a relationship between the changes in consumption and the discount rate. In our model, we calibrate the gamma outside, and we have the little interest rate as exogenous, and from the savings distribution, we would be able to identify the discount rate. In particular, in here, essentially in our model, we run OS regression of observed savings on measures of theta and measures of health, conditional other observables, and then those little coefficients from the regression are our movements for our to match. These are the covariance terms that help us identify the slope of those factor loadings inside of the discount rate, and this is essentially an indirect inference argument, and also the average savings rate would help us to identify the intercept of the discount rate. The estimation method is we first estimate the joint distribution of these 3 factors using a maximum likelihood approach, and next we use the simulated method of movements to estimate 59 parameters on preferences as well as the technology, and we have all those targeted movements. Is essentially the first part is essentially the regression coefficients for example, savings, health status, transitions, and wages to help us pin down the slopes of our preference parameters, and also we match up all those choice probabilities, transition probabilities over time. Yes.
So
So one question. So if I recall correctly, you've had like education and other parameters entering directly the utility function. So what is?
Excuse me, right?
So you had, for example, education entering directly the utility function. So what do you assume there? So it's like
The only place education enters utility function is that your education would affect your preference towards unhealthy behavior. Essentially, the way you think about identification is that you run a probability model of unhealthy behavior on the education, and we will match other part. But that's the only place that education enters utility function. Yeah. Now, the distribution of the latent factors is as follows. There are two takeaways from this big table. The first one is that if we see that individuals who have better health, whose parents are wealthier and have better education tends to be the ones that have better initial endowment in terms of cognitivity, non-cognitivity, as well as health. And the second takeaway from this picture is that these three factors, they are positive correlated. And in the initial distribution. And now let me show you what is our estimate for the discount factor. So we can calculate for each individual what is their discount factor based on the estimated parameters as well as their true abilities as well as their health. And you see that basically their discount factors would concentrate between 0.89 to 0.94, and pretty much the mean is 0.92. Now, this is estimated health production function from our model. So the y-axis is the log next period health minus your current health. This is, you can interpret it as the growth rate of your health or a percentage change of your health. And you would see that this, the direct impact of education allocation efficiency would be the parameter coefficient estimated here. And lastly, for the estimation part, I want to show you this sorting part. So we allow for individuals to have heterogeneity in terms of their initial cognitibility and non-cognitibility. And we would say that this would introduce a pretty sizable sorting based on their final education at age 30. You see individuals who have better education tend to also be the ones who have better cognitibility. You would see the similar pattern by non-cognitibility as well as by initial health. Now let me talk about the counterfactuals. So the first counterfactual experiment I want to do in this paper is that trying to decompose the adult inequality by the initial heterogeneity. In particular, I want to invite you to think about a counterfactual experiment that if what would happen to the inequality level at age 30 if from the very beginning everyone has the same level of initial cognitibility. And then the difference between the counterfactual experiment, in that counterfactual experiment, and the baseline model, which is the model we estimated from our data, would give us how important is how important it is for cognitibility to account for the inequality at the adulthood. So this is the result look like. So this is our baseline model. Our inequality in health is measured by standard deviation of log health, and the inequality measure of scale is standard deviation of log scale. And you see, this is our baseline model's measure of inequality. And then if we equalizing their cognitivity in the initial period, we get a slightly smaller measure of inequality. In terms of percentage reduction of inequality, we see that the initial difference in cognitivity would account for 9% of the adulthood health inequality, and a large fraction, 50% of inequality in skills. Similarly, we do the same set of counterfactual experiment to equalizing non-cognitibility, initial health, and the parental factors. You see that non-cognitibility counts for a sizable fraction of health, and the initial health also, not surprisingly, counts mostly for the adult health. And once we control for the initial abilities, the parental factor from this counterfactual experiment has to be small, have a smaller impact. Now, another way to think about how do we to look at our model is to think about the possible intervention to reduce poverty among the most disadvantaged population. In particular, we are considering early intervention, that this early intervention would increase the cognitive ability and non-cognitive ability by 0.1 standard deviation among the bottom 10% of the population in terms of cognitive ability and non-cognitive ability. And we can look at the predicted percentage change after the early intervention. In particular, so in terms of, we see that in terms of health at between age 18 and age 20, the percentage increase in health capital is about 0.66%. And over time, the gain in health would increase over time. This is precisely because the model would enable individuals who have, the model health is self-productive, and also your investment is complementary to your current health. Similarly, we see that there is also a sizable gain over time in terms of skills and also with consumption. So,
what does it mean to increase health by 3.4%?
So we estimate this basically from the observed health measures. We can factor out an underlying factor, which is health, and
but yeah, but that's an intrinsically ordinal measure, it seems to me now.
So another way to think about this is that one standard deviation increase in this health factor would increase your wage earnings by approximately 5%. And then you can link this to in terms of wage earnings as well.
But is that a relation linear?
Is that?
Is the relation between health and earnings linear?
Yeah, that's our estimation about how does health affect your human capital accumulation. Yeah. So another experiment we do is that we're trying to look at what would happen if we subsidize the tuition by $1,000. Basically, you see that this is a college tuition subsidy. You would see that for different quantiles of your cognitive ability, individuals would increase their college attendance at age 21 very slightly. Overall, there are 2 percentage points increase in college attendance. This would imply, based on our model, the elasticity of tuition subsidies about negative 0.16. This is well within the range of the previous literatures that studies the tuition subsidy. And within this experiment, the effect of tuition subsidy on unhealthy behavior is quite small. So now we move to a different experiment. In our model, we introduce endogenous credit strength. So what we do in this experiment is that we allow individuals to borrow up to their natural borrowing limit, meaning that we can calculate how much this individual can possibly pay back in the future as the maximum amount of money he can borrow today. And we would see a pretty sizable increase in the college attendance, especially among the high ability individuals. And you see that the 4-year college graduation rate in our current experiment of removing credit strength will also increase.
Do you have a sense for why you get much larger effects than, say, the non-competitor, which is the multi-paper?
For example,
Model is similar, except you have the health part on top. Is it because of the health part, or is it because of some other assumptions?
It could play a role, but I think the biggest difference that could make this difference is two. First is that we are using, the data is different. They are using 79, which you don't observe very sharp gradients based on the parental education. This is one difference. Another difference is that the way we are conducting this counterfactual is a little bit different. For King and Wapping, in their counterfactual study, they allow individuals to borrow up to $8,000 if they are in college. In here, we allow individuals to borrow according to our natural borrowing limit. So essentially, if I'm more educated, I can borrow more. So my ability of smoothing consumption is higher. So you would actually, I think both reasons are very important for us to have a large impact. In our model.
No, that would, you have more credit here in your environment than they did, though.
Yes, I do.
Closer to Johnson's paper in that.
Yes.
So you would think you would find less of a response to increase in volume?
we find a larger response. Yeah.
But that seems surprising, given you have a lot more credit in your environment than. Oh, I'm sorry. It is similar. Okay. But you think it's more to do? It's not because of the health aspect.
Health could also be possible, but so far for this experiment, we won't be able to separate. Health could be possible because individuals would care about their consumption, in the sense that if I go to school, that if I'm borrowing constraint, I have to endure much lower consumption current period. So the cost of borrowing constraint is larger compared to a model without health. That could be that could be part of it. So. Okay, so another part that we find a big induced response of removing credit constraint is that once credit constraint is removed, you see that individuals that, especially when they were young, they would respond in the sense that they will increase their unhealthy behavior. This is pretty intuitive in the sense that unhealthy behavior is another consumption goods. So once my credit constraint relaxed, I would tend to consume more of the consumption goods, even though they were a little bit bad. But over time, as individuals gain more education, you would see over time that the fraction of individuals who consume harmful goods would gradually reduce. And another part of this graph shows that who are the individuals who would change their unhealthy behavior. You see that larger fraction of response coming from the individual who are at the low quantile of their ability distribution, and they are the ones who would be affected the most. Because of the changes in unhealthy behavior as well as changes in education, you would see a very nonlinear relationship in terms of changes in health in this counterfactual experiment. In particular, in the beginning, in the very initial period, the median health level would decrease actually by about 0.9%, but over time, as the unhealthy behavior decreases, as well as the education increase, you would find basically the health would increase again. So lastly, this experiment we do that we trying to impose a revenue neutral excise tax, basically to impose tax on cigarette. This is a 50% of tax, and you would see that individual would basically reduce their unhealthy behavior consumption, especially at the very beginning. And the individuals who at the lower percentiles are the ones who would be affected the most. Because of such reduction in unhealthy behavior, and we see the predicted changes in health under the increased excise tax, you would see that once we impose this tax, we have sizable gains in terms of health. And we have additional takeaways of the model that we trying to do counterfactual study to evaluate the impact of health. And also we look at the effect of parental transfer, as well as what are the quantitative impact of rational addiction. Those are all in the paper. I'm not going to go into detail about them. Lastly, let me conclude. So in this model, we estimate a life cycle model with endogenous health, education, and wealth. And we evaluate the quantitative importance of socioeconomic factors as well as economic mechanisms. Within this model, in the future, we hope that we could study, for example, a broader inequality in terms of by race and by gender. For now, we only focus on white males. And also with this model, we hope to later trying to investigate the issues with respect to the intergenerational inequality by these different aspects.
Can I ask you, in the experiment where you, in fact, maybe I didn't understand, but you make people better off? Because they like to smoke, right?
I won't say I make people better off. I would say that there is better off only in terms of health. Yeah. But in terms of preference, some people may don't like it, because if they develop a preference towards smoking and I impose a tax on them, Because
here the only source of inefficiency is the borrowing constraint, no? The only reason why people might not be able to optimize fully is
because of there's a budget constraint. Yeah. This is the price. If I increase a particular price of a particular goods, based on the budget constraint, you would reduce the consumption of that goods.
Yeah, but that's not. They should be making sort of optimal decisions in this problem.
This is optimal decision.
So so I'm saying, why would you? I'm trying to ask.
Yeah. I'm trying to.
It's because we think that smoking is not good for them.
Yes.
Right. But they have preference. I mean,
Yes, that's exactly the reason that because that's the reason in our model we consider individual when they make decision, they have to take into consideration what their preference for smoking, and also they need to take into consideration what are the future benefits cost associated with smoking. They do. But this is a difference. This experiment of that I change the environment they face. I change the cost, monetary cost of cigarette, and they would respond optimally.
I'm just saying, why would we want to do this since they are doing the...
Why do I want to do this? Okay, this is have something to do with, I went to one of the tax conference, annual tax association conference in Boston. We present a paper there and come across some papers. People have been talking about that the taxation on cigarettes are regressive because it hurts people's income. What I want to say here is that, well, there are different dimensions of income of inequality. Not only there are income inequality, but also there are health inequality. I just want to bring the attention that we should not just only focus on the income dimension per se. We should also look at there are health benefits associated with
so
this.
by doing this tax, you do some redistribution. That's the idea here, I guess. What do you do redistribution?
Oh, I didn't.
Across people, not like within people.
This is cross people. This is the changes in health.
Yeah. The other friction is the epsilon shocks that aren't insurable, right?
Yeah.
So that might improve welfare. Some kind of a tax and redistribution would probably improve welfare.
I should tell you that I've already gone back and forth a few times with Rong and Jim. And on the last round, which was at lunch, Jim told me that I should let him have it. So I'm going to do that. Jim, you're really ugly. Okay, but actually, some of my slides are now really moot because of some of the conversations that we've had, and so I'll skip over those when we reach those points. Okay, so
He was a super discussant. It's just that he shared the slides with us in advance, so and we had a chance to iterate several times.
So Rong re-estimated the whole model over the last 2 days, right? Okay, so I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about identification because in the first iteration, this looked like a paper that was not identified in any sense, although that turned out to be just a small communication problem. So let's talk about differences between structural estimation and reduced form estimation. So first of all, reduced form economists don't really know what reduced form means. They also seem to be obsessed with finding exogenous sources of variation, and while structural economists rely pretty much only on functional form for identification. So both of those statements are a bit too extreme, but there's also some truth to both sides of that. So some of my discussion is going to be about identification, but before we do that, I want to bring up a couple of concerns that I have about the model and maybe the data too. So the authors have a human capital accumulation equation, which I think is a little bit unconventional and in ways that seem unnecessary and that also unnecessarily increase the size of the state space. So their human capital equation says that human capital is a function of today's health, today's education, and today's experience. As opposed to a model where human capital today is a function of last period's human capital and maybe today's health and whether or not you go to school today or work today. The advantages of the second over the first are, first of all, it requires a much smaller state space. If you have an equation like the second one, you don't have to keep track of the amount of education that people have every period or the amount they've worked. All you have to keep track of is how much human capital they have. That's not observed, but that's not particularly relevant to solving the dynamic programming problem. Okay, let's see, who did that? Good. Oh no, one more. How do I go back on this thing? Good. Okay, one more thing about this. You could even do better by reducing the number of possible levels of human capital that people can have, and think of education and or experience as affecting the probability that you move from one level of human capital to another. This was suggested a few years ago to me by John Kennan, and he gave Chris credit for that. So maybe you can verify that that's right?
I have no idea.
Okay, no idea. Okay, so we still don't know.
I'll take credit for anything.
Okay, second problem. They have a model of intergenerational transmission where parents are providing exogenous benefits to children. The child grows up, but the child never has children and never pays for children. And so there's a certain lack of consistency in the model, and that also means that, well, if they had allowed for that, that would suggest that many of the variables that they treat as exogenous are not really exogenous. Okay. Okay, so the decision about modeling variation in discount factors is an interesting question. The way that they model that is they say that the discount rate of person I at time t depends upon the health at time t, and then these two unobserved variables, one which is a measure of cognitive skills and the other measure of non-cognitive skills. Okay. Actually, what's on my page is a little bit wrong, but what I'm going to show you next I've done correctly. If you simulate the distribution of discount factors, then you get the picture that you see on the wall. And actually, this is pretty close to the picture that Ron produced, except hers was a density, mine's a distribution. What this says is that 80% of the variation in discount factors is between 0.9 and 0.92. I would say that's not a lot of variation, and it has a couple of implications. One is it doesn't sound like it's an important source of variation, and so it's not clear that it's worth including that in the model. And the other is what is allowing for such precise estimates of the coefficients in that equation when there is no meaningful variation and nothing in that model is observed. Okay, next, bad effects of smoking. So I would say that the bad effect of smoking is that you're going to die, you're more likely to die early when you reach ages like 60. It's not going to have big effects on your health when you're in your 20s or maybe even your 30s. In fact, I believe there are a number of papers that say if you stop smoking in your 30s, then you get rid of all of the bad effects that you developed over that time. That's not the same thing as reducing the discount rate. And in fact, for the most part, if we knew that smoking was going to make you die 10 years earlier, let's say 70 instead of 80, that would be irrelevant to someone who's 20 because they would be discounting it at such a great rate that what's happening that far in advance really doesn't matter very much. Okay. A bigger problem, which also was partially solved in, which Rang made a better presentation of today than was in the paper, was the motivation for the choice of variables that they were including in their model. There still are some problems with that. So, no, we're not up to that yet. Smoking is one of the problems. I'm not sure that I think of smoking as, it certainly is a bad behavior, but it's probably not that tied to what happens in the labor market. And and thus it's not that clear that that's really what you should be focusing on. It's probably not a big determinant of inequality, for example. It might be correlated with other determinants of inequality, but that's a different matter. Okay, it's not clear why habit formation there is a particularly important part of this story either. And so I think I would think harder yet about what the crucial parts of this model are and which parts are not that important. Okay, so now we get to identification. So I think of identification in three parts. First of all, ignore endogeneity and just think about what's going to estimate parameters associated with exogenous explanatory variables. In the first draft of their paper, none of those were identified. None is a little strong. Most of those were not identified, but that again was because there was some text missing and a table missing, which suggested, well, which told you what the important moments are that they were including, and then it was obvious that a lot of those were identified. The second thing that I think about it with identification is identifying higher order moments, like variances. That had the same problem, and it's also not a problem anymore. The last problem is problems with identification associated with endogenous variables. And here they still have a problem. It's not clear in their model what is exogenous. I think they want to say that characteristics of the parent is exogenous, but that's probably not true. There are some things that they could have included that would be exogenous, but they didn't include them. I'm going to skip things. Okay. Okay, so things that they could include that you could plausibly argue are exogenous are variation in prices of cigarettes, local variation in the quality of schools maybe, other things like that. They don't want to do that because then they would have to evaluate value functions for people, for each set of people who face a different value of those exogenous variables. But that's a trade-off. On the one hand, you estimate a more expensive model. On the other, you have exogenous variation. I would argue that you can't go all the way and knock out all of the exogenous variation. My guess is that even if you were to include these types of variables, it's still not obvious that everything's identified. And I think you have to think a lot harder about where the exogenous variation is and then make sure that everything is still identified. Okay, last, there's one really, really nice thing about the model. The model has cognitive and non-cognitive skills that are affecting smoking behavior. The model has non-cognitive skills imperfectly measured by, among other things, teenage sexual behavior. And so the model explains why people like to smoke after they have sex.
Thanks, Steve. So yesterday, Steve asked me if I like this joke at last slide. Well, not really to my taste, so. But thank you very much. Steve is very nice. He sent us his slides about his comments several days ahead, so Tim and I were able to discuss make a lot of things, especially regarding to the identification much clearer, and we really own him on that. Thank you so much. I'm going to, and then I write down his comments one by one, respond in this order. So yes, our model do not have children, and we do hope that with this framework in the next paper, we could go for a full model with intergeneration mobility that is really high analysis of people. And for identification, and for example, I try to present in today. trying to suggest that we can essentially use the correlation between settings and the measures of health which are observed to identify the discount rate. We can talk more if you not agree. And yes, we really appreciate your discussion about to think about alternate ways that we can reduce the state space in the model, definitely. And about smoking and also why the habit formation is very important. So actually, we do have counterfactual experiment in the paper, actually in the appendix. We have a very lengthy appendix as many of Jim's paper. So we're trying to say that what would happen. Really, we also are interested in the model features. We're trying to say that if we shut down, for example, the forward-looking, what would happen, take out the rational part of smoking behavior, what would happen. And we also try down just basically set the preference parameter in front of the habit to be 0, and basically there will be no addiction, what would happen. And you do see that there's sizable changes in terms of the pattern, basically the life cycle pattern in terms of unhealthy behavior, and that does matter. And also in terms of we do see a much larger response in terms of once we do the tax experiment, and that would make an effect in the framework of rational addiction model compared to another just a myopic model, for example. And yes, we agree that we don't we didn't include the variations in terms of exogenous prices into the model. It is a hard trade-off. We hope that we could do better. And thank you.